So today we'll be looking at routing security and probably even broader traffic security from a perspective of enterprises. The reliance of enterprise on the internet is becoming only bigger. They increasingly store their data and other digital assets online using third-party cloud services. They use internet connectivity to conduct business-to-business operations and serve their customers. This significantly extends the security perimeter way beyond their physical boundaries and make them vulnerable to infrastructure attacks and routing security attacks in particular. Besides their critical dependency on already mentioned CDN and cloud providers, there is another essential relationship, and that's their connectivity providers, which could be a threat vector or their first line of defense. So, does routing security matter to enterprise and how? As I said, we have an excellent lineup of panelists that will help us better understand those threats and opportunities in this space. Let me introduce them to you. Antoin Verschuren is leading the network security team at Liberty Global that is driving implementation of network security best current practices such as MANAS for this Tier 1 transit ISP and relevant operational companies. Antoin has been involved in standardization in the IETF since 1998 for security enhancements to existing routing and signaling protocols such as DNS and BGP, and is currently chairing the Registration Protocols Detection Working Group. Benjamin Broersma is an Internet Security Standards Advisor at the Netherlands Standardization Forum. He has a background in computer science and considers himself a hacker. The forum recommended putting RPKI to the comply or explain policy list of the Dutch government, and this year recommended a government-wide implementation deadline for RPKI by the end of 2024. Both forum recommendations were adopted. Benjamin is responsible for the government-wide Internet Security Compliance Scan and is part of the project team of the Internet.nl project. Fredrik Korsbäck is a senior infrastructure business developer for Amazon Web Services with a passion for routing security. Fredrik has been involved in all of the AWS recent efforts in improving routing security on behalf of the customers of AWS. Abley has been building and breaking networks on the internet for almost 3 decades, working with exchange points, global backbone networks, and critical DNS infrastructure. He has volunteered in leadership positions at NZNOG, NANOG, the IETF, ICANN, and DNS.org, and remains the only person ever to have contributed code to the FreeBSD kernel written in Oak. Joe works now at Cloudflare as a senior engineering manager, helping in his small way to build a better internet. Linda Bertz is a consultant for FS-ISAC, focused on the insurance sector, and is the acting CICO. Linda has held CICO positions at IBM, Travelers Insurance, and the Federal Home Loan Bank of the United States. Linda received her PhD in information security from Nova Southeastern University in the US. Matt Davy has been a chief network architect at Visa, focusing primarily on WAN, internet, and automation for the last 7 years. Prior to Visa, he spent over 20 years in various areas of networking at startups, universities, and large ISPs. And I'm Andrei Robachevsky, a host and a moderator of this session. I'm a senior director for technology programs at the Internet Society, where for more than 12 years, I'm helping to solve internet infrastructure security issues. All right, so let me welcome our excellent panelists. And hi, everyone, once again. That's great to see you all joining this session. Let me start to set the context and introduce this issue with a short presentation. Let me share my screen. See if I can do that. Okay, I hope you can see the screen. Okay, great. So I will not go deeper into the issue of BGP security, because I'm sure that many of people in the audience, they're very well familiar and actually dealing with those issues in day-to-day. But for the sake of completeness, and just to remind all of us that the issue with BGP is that it was not designed with security in mind. And while networks exchange reachability information among themselves, they can lie to each other and therefore distort this routing roadmap of the internet. And as a result, BGP is vulnerable to both malicious attacks and human mistakes. Now, this is just to give you an example that this is not just a theoretical research question. BGP insecurity causes real-world issues. And those are just hitting the headlines, and I picked up some of them, but I assure you those incidents happen every day. Some of them actually go unnoticed because they might disguise themselves as just connectivity loss or something like this. And before the real origin is, real causes is investigated, it's over. And another thing with this attacks is that because routing is so fundamental, many attacks on the higher levels, they use routing system vulnerabilities to mount them. For instance, this clay swap incident was a software distribution server which was hijacked using routing security, and so on and so forth. Now, a funny thing that BGP insecurity was known basically since the deployment of BGP. And yet we're making very slow progress in securing the global routing system. So the question is, why is routing security so hard? Well, here we have a clear collective action problem where every network has responsibility to implement basic routing security practices, but it doesn't bring immediate benefits to those who implement that. Moreover, you can say that security of a network is in the hands of other operators, and therefore the business case is not very strong. And even if you do everything right, your security there, right? So you cannot secure your network in the global routing system by yourself. So this is a classic collective action problem. One of the possible solutions to those problems lies in norm setting efforts, and MANIS is one of them. And MANIS stands for Mutually Agreed Norms for Routing Security. We have almost 1,000 participants now in this initiative, and this improves visibility, awareness of those issues, and their commitment. And their commitment is demonstrated by implementation of what we call MANIS actions. So we have different programs, as you probably know, in MANIS, such as Network Operators Program, IXP Program, CDN Cloud Providers Program. But actions sort of rotate around the same themes. They're very important, such as filtering, such as preventing incorrect announcement being propagated or emitted by a network, anti-spoofing, preventing traffic with spoofed source IP addresses, coordination, that is meaning that you're accessible to others, because attacks can spam the globe and you may need to contact not your immediate peer, but the network on another side of the globe to mitigate certain attacks. So coordination and availability of those contacts and their responsiveness is super important. And of course, because BGP doesn't have intrinsic mechanism to validate the correctness of the announcements, all the tools rely on external data sources where this routing information is stored, the intent. So correctness, maintenance of this routing information is of ultimate importance. And of course, tools and promotion. Now, well, I said almost 1,000 networks, but the internet is much bigger. We have about more than 74,000 networks. almost 1 million prefixes are announced on the internet. The question is it actually feasible to secure this? Also provide that this is a system which has no central control, which is distributed and decentralized. Well, there are two answers to this question. First of all, security is not a state, it's a process, right? So you can't secure the system, but you can make it more secure. And every network that joins, well, not necessarily joins Manus, but implements the at least base security line for routing security, it mitigates, even if slightly, the risk of routing incidents and mitigates and minimizes their impact. And another thing is closer to the theme of our session today is that if you look at this CADA map, which maps all networks in the internet and their connectivity, you see this very sort of big edge. And this edge are actually enterprises. And enterprises, while they're not making a lot of routing decisions, they make decisions on selecting their connectivity providers. And those can be and should be their first line of defense, securing this vast perimeter of the internet routing system. So there might be a business case here, and we're going to discuss this if that's true. So if you look at enterprises, for them, the internet is actually quite smaller. It's not all the 74,000. They have their partners, their providers, where they keep their digital assets, as I mentioned already, and they have their partners for business-to-business relationships. So, in fact, in connecting to those entities, they're not using the whole internet. They're using maybe one, maybe two, maybe three service providers. So if they can assure high routing security stance for those providers, I think they can assure certain end-to-end traffic security for their operations. So let me prove this. We did some research and we looked at some real live cases of, for instance, here of Australian banking. We picked up a few enterprises, a few banks in Australia, and looked at who are their connectivity providers and what is the path from them to their digital, to common places where enterprises store their digital assets, such as Rackspace, Amazon, Microsoft, Akamai. And, interesting thing is that there are not many intermediaries on this way, maximum 2 and sometimes 1. And also mapped the conformance of those connectivity providers to Manus actions. So you can see yellow is aspiring, blue is ready, and red is unfortunately lagging. So by selecting your provider wisely, which doesn't have red and maybe it doesn't have even yellow, I think you can improve your own security, your supply chain security. Another example, which is more about business-to-business relationships, here we have a connectivity graph for automotive industry, again, cherry-picking some of the enterprises, car manufacturers on the left, and their suppliers on the right. And again, you see, well, a slightly different picture, but if you looked at their connectivity providers selected by the car manufacturers and their connectivity providers selected by the suppliers, and in between, sometimes there are no intermediaries. So they, in fact, are in complete control, or should be in complete control of their supply chain. So here's a use case. As I said, select your connectivity provider wisely, and you can ensure that your supply chain is secure, or at least the risks in your supply chain are minimized. And I'm putting here Manus Plus because this work is already underway. We have a working group in Manus that is working on this kind of new framework, how we can, what kind of requirements we can implement or request that would be interesting for enterprises and necessary for securing this supply chain. So what does this plus mean compared to Manus? Well, first of all, stronger and more detailed requirements, high level of assurance and conformance. Although in manners, we already have certain level of assurance, but here we want to get deeper. So it's really high level of assurance. So if someone you're contracting is manners plus provider, you can be sure that they implement all the requirements correctly. There is a thought of extended set of requirements, and we'll look into this in this session, covering a broader set of risks, not just routing security, but what we call traffic security, a wider, broader set of issues, and much more focus on demands of enterprise customers in various industry sectors. I will not go through all the requirements, but you will see them on the graph, and probably will look at them through the discussion with the panelists. Routing a path security, that's a common thing, doesn't need an explanation. It resonates with manners filtering requirement. Distributed denial of service attack prevention or protection. That's a new one, and we wanted to test if that's something that enterprise would be interested in seeing this capability in their connectivity provider. Anti-spoofing protection, well, that's similar to manners. Routing information, we talked about that. Operational communication coordination. Again, you can see this in base manners. New things are supply chain transparency. And what we mean here is that in the cases where there are more than one intermediary, you might want to see the whole sort of supply chain to your business-to-business relationship or to your storage of digital assets. And if your connectivity provider can provide additional information that might be valuable to you. And last but not least is security services. And we know that some of the enterprises just simply don't have resources to properly secure that network from a routing security perspective to ensure that their equipment is configured correctly to high standards and so on and so forth. So they might want to get those services, and probably connectivity providers is a logical place to go. So when we sort of put this list of requirements, of course, important questions are, okay, well, we think those are important, but what do enterprises think of those requirements? And the way we wanted to validate these requirements, or answer that question, is by conducting a survey. So we launched a survey, and we got more than 80 responses, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank everyone who participated in the survey. Those were very valuable results. I will not go into deep analysis of the results, but I would like to show one of the graph, and hopefully our panelists can reflect on that. So we got, as I said, more than 80 responses, but most statistically representative responses, meaning there were between 10 and 20 responses, came from two industries: technology, general technology, finance, and education. So I put here those three, and compared to all, that's an average score, how they rated the requirements I just mentioned to you. So you can see all those requirements are rated between fairly important and high business value. And above high business value, that's essential, which is required in the contracts. And some of the enterprise, they indeed rated some of the requirements that high. Now here we have a weighted average, so you don't see this 5 showing up here on this chart. But you can see that maybe supply chain transparency and security services got slightly less importance, but overall across those industries, you can see sort of, I think, validating our assumption that those requirements would be important. And I think that ends my presentation. Let me stop sharing the slides and pause for a while, see if there are any questions from the audience or any remarks. And we can move to our panel then. Okay, Robbie? There are 2 questions. Let me see the chat because I couldn't see this when I shared the what metrics I used to assign. Slide 10. Okay, let me see if I can locate the slide. 9, 10, yes, okay. So for this slide, the color, those are colors that one can see in the Manus Observatory. So I used similar colors, and blue is ready, meaning that a network operator is compliant with the requirements of a particular action. So each sector represents an action. F, filtering. C, coordination. IRR is that routing information is properly registered in the IRR system. RPKI means that routing information is properly registered in the RPKI system. And route origin validation, that's not an action in Manus, but we thought would be useful to just see in this particular picture. So blue is ready, meaning fully compliant. Yellow is aspiring, meaning that it's not fully compliant, but it's not as bad. We have a certain sort of, ranges where we assign this label, and lagging, meaning a network operator is not compliant. For instance, they register less than 50% of their prefixes in RPKI or IRR, just to give you an example. Does that answer the question? Oh, the metrics. You can go to Manus Observatory and go into About and Measurement Framework. You can see all the metrics. So different actions are measured differently. For instance, for filtering, we count number of incidents where a particular network was a culprit, and normalizing that, it creates a metric. Similarly, the percentage of routes or prefixes, announced prefixes registered in the routing information repository, such as RPKI or IRR, that's a metric. But for full details, please go to Manus Observatory, which is observatory.manus.org. Click on About and select the measurement framework, and you will see the full details of those metrics. Okay, are there more questions I missed? Okay, let me move to a more exciting part of our session. Let me turn to moderators, and you can continue asking questions, and probably moderators can answer your questions even better than I am. And let me turn first to Matt, who is working for Visa and representing, can share the enterprise view of things. So Matt, we got responses from a wide range of industry sectors. What do you think? You looked at the survey and you probably get more detailed results of the survey. Does this resonate with the perspective of financial sector enterprises?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, one interesting thing from your survey results were particularly for financial, were the importance of DDoS relative to the importance of routing security. And the numbers on DDoS were significantly higher in terms of importance to the business. I thought that was a really kind of interesting observation from those responses, right? One, it shows that the internet is very important, obviously, from the DDoS perspective. I think particularly in financial, there's a tendency to think of people having private connections directly to their business partners to do their the business, and that's the most important. But obviously, given the importance of DDoS, the internet is also very important there, and the relatively lower importance of routing security obviously could could have to do with just the incidence, right, of DDoS versus the number of instances of routing security leaks. But I think it to me, it's kind of more than that. Like you said, routing security is kind of this collective action problem, right? How do we get hundreds of ISPs implementing these best practices? And I think as an enterprise, you feel like you don't have a lot of ability to influence that, right? You're not an ISP. You interact with only a relatively small number of ISPs. So your ability to kind of influence that and drive that direction doesn't maybe feel like you have much of an influence there. But I think the reality is that you do, as you said in your connectivity, diagrams. It's not like you rely on hundreds of ISPs to get all of your traffic through the internet. It's probably a fairly small number, and so I think there really is an ability to influence where it makes sense for you as a business and the majority of your internet traffic, particularly if you have the ability to kind of drive that through your procurement process.
Yeah, great point. And the point you're making, the last point, is that, so do you think that enterprises really see their internet connectivity as supply chain issue, or do they see sort of this great internet of unknown that is a big threat, such as DDoS or something like this? So is there a chance they will look at the small internet, the critical part of the internet that they need to secure supply chain security?
Yeah, I do think so. And I think the main thing is that they need, the tools to sort of drive that, right? And to vet their suppliers. And I think, the challenge of that today is that ends up being kind of a long technical conversation, right? You have to have your engineers ask your providers, do you do prefix-based filtering on your customers? But not just that, do you have a process in place to make sure those always get implemented? Do you automate that? Do you have an audit process to make sure if those get removed, that gets caught and they get added back? For your customers that you can't do prefix filtering on, do you have AS path filtering? Do you do prefix limits? It becomes this kind of long, drawn out technical discussion. And that's something that's, I think, challenging to drive through an enterprise procurement process, right? What you really need is something that you can say, do you meet this standard, yes or no? And if you had that, it would be a lot easier to drive sort of the demand side of this equation, right? Where you can just say, put this in my RFP. And even if that's not everything you would like to see, it meets a certain baseline. And that would really help drive, the demand side.
Excellent points. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And let me switch to Linda, because Linda is working for FS-ISAC. And Linda, you have a lot of members from financial sector. But it's not specifically financial sector, but we had several attempts to reaching out to industry sectors outside telecommunication, right, with issue of routing security. And it doesn't necessarily resonate all the time. They understand the threat, but it's not in their the critical thing that they need to work on. Routing security is something other day, maybe. So what's your perspective? You also saw those connectivity graphs. Do they see this kind of their business-to-business relationship, or they're increasingly using the internet for, reaching out to customers or store their digital assets? Do they see this, the need to better approach to security issues related to routing, traffic security, and the internet in general?
Yes, I think so, but Matt answered the question really well, and I had the same kind of notes. So I almost want to start out with the fact that the survey said in the financial sector that DDoS was more like 95% high and essential, versus the routing security and supply chain was around 60% high and essential. My feeling is that DDoS has been around a long time, and it's quite clear what you're supposed to do when you can buy a product or a service to go deal with it. And Matt really kind of started to lead us down that path. I think routing and supply chain has become so complicated right now, and you have to figure out how you deal with it. I want to hit supply chain first. I mean, we used to be a castle and you know, with a moat, and you ended up figuring out and assessing who was in. And now with all the connections we have, it's really a web of so many different vendors and technologies. And it used to be that you would go ask questionnaires, and some of the biggest companies don't even want to answer a questionnaire. They just want to show you what certifications they have, be it a SOC 2 Type 2, or they have an ISO certification or something like that. So I think supply chain is so complicated right now. People don't know what to do on top of what they're doing today. They're doing questionnaires, they're looking for standard certifications, and that's not good enough because there's attacks on the supply chain all the time, and people are going from one crisis to the next. But if you look at the routing piece of the supply chain, it almost seems like Manners has set it up easier to be able to go look for a certification, because most vendors are never going to go to that level of depth with you know, with a financial services company. So I think it's very, you know, this landscape is changing. And I also think that financial services companies are trying to figure out how to advance what they're asking their vendors. And if they can ask it in a very standardized way, that becomes a whole lot easier than trying to go into detailed questions, which most vendors won't spend time with you on.
Excellent point. Thank you very much, Linda. And I think, yeah, that resonates with what Matt said, that there is a lack of tools. Well, if you call like a certification a tool, easy way to assess your supply chain or framework that helps you to assess your supply chain in that particular domain. But let me turn to sort of connectivity provider, right? The very important intermediary that can help a lot. And let me turn to Antoin. And Antoin, so according to the graphs, and I mean, take that with a grain of salt, it was some research. We didn't validate those paths with connectivity provider, but those are feasible paths. So we see in many cases, the path between the enterprise and the assets or their business partner doesn't exceed one or two intermediaries, right? Does it mean that connectivity provider can significantly mitigate risks to end-to-end routing security for enterprise? Can they sort of, you know, market their position as securing providing end-to-end security for enterprises? And when there are more intermediaries in the path, how can enterprise, from your perspective, evaluate this end-to-end security?
Yeah, well, good question. Before I start on actually answering the question, and to make it a little bit more interactive, I want to challenge something that was said by you, Andrei, also by Matt and by Linda. The first thing is, you know, enterprises, they don't see immediate benefits from implementing routing security, and I want to challenge that. Let me start with telling a little anecdote. When I started in the ISP business 29 years ago, very simple things like domain registration or IP address registration was done by our secretary during her lunch break. Because it was considered to be only an administrative one-off thing that needed to happen because somebody told them to, but nobody actually realized that it was very important in the whole routing security. So now that in the past decade we have been implementing these routing security measures, people, and especially enterprises, you know, law firms, all sorts of companies whose primary business isn't networking, they did this 20 years ago, forgot about it, and never actually monitor it or go back to it. So there is something that they can do, because now there is routing security, and it makes a difference when their administration is in order. And to give you a little bit of experience on what we saw when we started doing routing security 5 years ago, when we implemented RPKI validation, we saw that 80% of the network incidents didn't cause outages anymore, which means that the network became a lot more stable for all our other users. When we implemented source address validation on our network, we saw that 20% of traffic that is usually abused in DDoS attacks like amplified DNS traffic or NTP traffic, it dropped by 20% and nobody complained. So it means that we got a lot more capacity on our network by blocking this illegitimate traffic. And the best part is, of course, that our customers don't pay for illegitimate traffic. They only pay for the legitimate traffic that they send to us. So it does have an immediate impact if enterprises, one, make sure that their administration is in order for themselves, but also choose a connectivity provider that is manners compliant, because it means stable connections, it means more capacity for their networks. So it does have some immediate benefits. So now back to your question. When there are multiple players in the path, how much impact does it have? Well, when we look at the incident, especially the routing incident, 95% of the incidents are still, indeliberate mistakes. People that don't have their administration in order, they forget to add route objects or delete stale route objects. They don't have RPKI ROAS implemented. They change routing or they change their provider and they forget to adjust these things. That's 95% of the routing security incidents that we see. That means that from a security monitoring perspective, or from an engineering perspective, whenever a new incident occurs, everybody's saying, it's probably some engineer who did something wrong. It will probably be fixed within a week. Let's ignore it and not look at it. And then the one time that it is a serious malicious attack, everybody will think it's a false positive. So I think that in order to be able to secure the whole path, the first thing we need to get rid of is these mistakes that we see as routing incidents. And actually, when we do that, we will be able to see the whole path security. There's a proposal now in the IETF, at least, for ASPA, which means you track basically the security of your whole path. And once that's implemented in a few years, you will be able to be notified when something in the path is not secure enough. So that's in the future. But you're right. I do think that indeed the first thing you need to do is start looking at yourself, make sure your administration is correct for all the resources that you have. And then the second thing really is choose a manners compliant infrastructure provider, because it will not only make you more secure, it will also mean that you have a more stable network and you have more capacity. And then the second thing, of course, is to have suppliers on the other end of the path. And I think that somebody else is going to talk about that when we're talking cloud providers. If you choose cloud providers or other service providers that are manners compliant, then you basically have the two the 2 points in the path already secured, and it's only less than 1% that will be of an issue, and we will easily be able to spot that.
Great answer, thank you, Antoin. And to your first part, where you said that it takes two, or actually many entities to play tango, I'd like to see if Linda or Matt would like to respond to that. And my also additional question to that is like, do enterprise realize that they have a role in routing security, or they say, well, we are completely at hand of our connectivity provider and have nothing to do here?
So from a financial services perspective, I mean, I think the members are absolutely interested in understanding all of that. And as manners becomes more prevalent, I would think that it's almost easy to ask that question, are you compliant? I also want to say that the web may be bigger because it's easier to look at your most critical suppliers being, your internet provider and maybe your cloud infrastructure as a service provider. But SaaSes exist, which then sit on other, fourth party. So the complexity of the network for an enterprise can be more than the major, cloud providers and internet providers.
Yeah, and I just wanted to echo that, and Antoin, you made a great point about ASPA, and one of the notes I'd made was, Andrei, in your earlier slide, you showed some leaks, and there was a leak in May involving Angola cable, and I thought one of the things that was interesting about that is, that many of the routes that were involved, in fact, did have ROAs, and some of the providers that accepted those, in fact, did have route origin validation. So we do need to go, kind of a step further. And I think this kind of points to the place enterprises are in, that they go, wait, the person leaking, the organization leaking, I don't have an interaction with the ISPs that were accepting that. I don't have a contract with, but I do run, have resources in this cloud or run traffic through the CDN, and they were impacted. So you're really 2 or 3 levels kind of removed from, directly being able to impact the prevention of that, which I think speaks to kind of how enterprises feel maybe a bit disconnected in being able to influence and stop those events.
Thank you both. So let's look at the sort of endpoint, so to say, but maybe not just endpoint, but also some transit point. And look at CDN and cloud providers, what's their perspective. And Joe, maybe let me start with you. So in many cases, enterprise customers, they interconnect directly with CDN, right? And Cloudflare has a lot of points of presence, but sometimes they're intermediaries in the path. So what can Cloudflare, or what does Cloudflare, or just in general, CDN or cloud providers do to ensure traffic security in both scenarios?
Well, I think it's a mistake sometimes. People think about cloud providers and other sort of infrastructure as a service providers as being some sort of black box. They can just, some sort of magic that happens. If you use the magic box, then everything is fine. But I think the important thing to realize is that cloud providers are enterprises just like everybody else is an enterprise. Everybody has a responsibility to control, to the largest extent they can, the performance and the availability of the services they provide, which includes all kinds of aspects like being able to handle excess traffic, being able to mitigate it, being able to propagate routes in such a way that you can be more confident that they arrive where you need them to arrive. So I think the question about what do cloud providers do is interesting, because cloud providers generally have the resources to do things at scale that an enterprise can't do. Same way that a cloud provider might be able to deploy compute at scale that an individual bank might not find feasible, and therefore there's an economy of scale. Same thing when you're buying outsourced network and network reliability, which is really what companies like Cloudflare are doing. So Cloudflare can afford, as you said, to deploy 350 points of presence globally. We can reduce that supply chain between our points of presence and the consumer, if we think about an end user, by deploying in 350 different places. You can't do that if you're a small enterprise. It doesn't make sense. But you can do it if you have a large number of customers and can build at scale. So I think, what we look at is, when we look at routing security, cloud providers are not different, but they have greater resources to put to play. And I think we get to do the full spectrum. And I think Manners has done a great job at emphasizing that routing security is not something you just turn on. It's not a checkbox. It's not just deploy route origin validation, or it's not just publish ROAs, something else like that. It's a whole spectrum of stuff, which really involves a full awareness of exactly where your route's propagating, what routes you're receiving, what that's doing to the traffic, and how you moderate this in real time. And again, that's something you can do at scale when it's your business to do it, not so much when, availability across the internet is just a cost and something you prefer to outsource. So I think all the things we do are good, but I think what's more obvious when you do this stuff at scale is that what we're doing today is, on a good day, adequate for today, but we have a lot more good things we could do in the future. A lot of those things also require collaboration. A lot of those things require standardization. Antoin mentioned a couple of them in the IETF, but even some basic things, like onboarding prefixes. You might worry about prefix hijacks from an obscure part of the planet. But what if somebody just onboards your prefix onto a provider like Cloudflare or AWS and advertises it from their infrastructure? Then you're dragging traffic down not to some remote part of a poorly connected AS in another country that you normally have no business with, but you're actually dropping those routes and traffic into 350 locations. So with that sort of reach, with that sort of impact on the routing system, companies like Cloudflare also have a responsibility to be extra stringent when we onboard customers' prefixes, when we take their traffic, and make sure that if we are actually advertising a prefix. We can sign it. We can make sure it's signed. But that doesn't help. Signing something that's wrong is actually kind of worse than not signing something that's wrong, because it makes it harder to detect for other parts of the system. So I think we have a lot more work to do. And I think our jobs as cloud network providers, and I think we're all kind of in the same business when it comes to routing, is to try and work out how we can do this at scale, which means it has to be more reliable. We need more automated methods to mitigate problems when they come, to observe problems when they're happening ahead of time. Nobody wants to be called by a customer in order to find out there's a problem in their routing system. So I think these are the kinds of challenges. And I think the function then of a cloud provider or CDN is really to collapse that complicated supply chain that is complicated. If you're an enterprise dealing with BGP and autonomous system numbers and routing internet registries and RPKI hosted or not, it's all very complicated for something that's such a tiny part of your business. And what you're doing with a provider like a cloud provider or a CDN is you're collapsing that, and you're taking one provider that can basically conceal all of that complexity and provide a level of service. So, I mean, that's good from the point of view of being able to do things effectively, more effectively than you can do yourself, but you're also collapsing that supply chain and making sure that you've got a lot of eggs in one basket. So these things have to be balanced. And this is where the reputation of cloud providers, CDNs, comes to play. And, there's a reason why we have a competitive landscape, and that's because not every solution suits every customer, but we have a lot of measurement going on around the place, and people choose what suits them.
Great perspective. So I think you're suggesting collapsing the internet even smaller than I presented in my slide. But there's still cases, Joe, where your customers can't connect directly to Cloudflare, right? They're using their intermediaries. What would be your sort of recommendation to them in how they should secure the supply chain from them to you?
So I think there's two aspects to that. And you're right, we either have a short path to the consumer in the terms of a browser, someone using someone's site, or we have a short path to the provider of the content. We don't usually have both. So in one direction or the other, we generally have a routing path where we have risks that we have to mitigate. So in both cases, the people originating the prefixes have an incentive to deliver the traffic. If you're an ISP, an access provider somewhere in the world, you're going to lose customers if you can't provide access to the sites that matter. And on the other side, if you're trying to publish a web service, you're going to lose your own customers if you don't have the ability to attract traffic correctly to your origin servers behind the CDN. So the kinds of things we do, the standard things that Manners has done such a good job of promoting with. We make sure that our upstreamers trust our routes. We make sure that we have a good reputation operationally. We communicate. We validate routes that we receive. We encourage our customers, if it's their prefixes, to publish their own certificates with their own ROAs. We publish them for our own routes. And all of this stuff is good, and we follow these best practices, and I still say it's not sufficient. I still would say we have more to do. The easy example is route origin validation, which is great at detecting accidental leaks, but is terrible at detecting hijacks. Because if you want to hijack someone else's prefix, you just prepend the correct AS number, and then the validation will pass. So, I mean, this is an area where Antoin mentioned where there's more work being done. But I think it's important to realize this is not the end of the road. We do the best we can, but we have to work around the automated methods and the cryptography and fill in the gaps with people and knowledge.
Thank you, Joe. So let me turn to Fredrik, the cloud provider, AWS. Fredrik, what's your perspective here? I mean, I would repeat the same question that I asked Joe. I mean, you are the endpoint for many, many enterprise customers. I mean, first of all, what can you do and what you're doing already, I know, to secure that path, and what would you recommend to your customers, apart from, connect directly to Amazon, what would you recommend, how they can secure their supply chain to you? That is sort of my bunch of questions to you, Fredrik.
Yeah, thanks, Andrei. Yeah, I lost about 10 minutes of conversation here. I had to switch to a mobile internet, unfortunately. So hopefully I will not repeat myself that much. No, I mean, I just have to repeat a little bit what Joe said, right? Like I essentially agree with everything. But some of the things that we see, right, is that we work much closer with enterprise today than we perhaps did a couple of years ago. Not only on selling the stuff, right, but also in connectivity factors. Like today, AWS can be not only your cloud and CDN, to some extent, we're a connectivity provider as well. Like Bring Your Own IP is, I guess, an interesting service we've been doing for a few years, which has taught us a lot that the system we are working with is very brittle as it stands today. Like enterprises do not have a lot of knowledge in this sector, right? Like we have written extremely detailed tutorials on how to enroll IP space on AWS. And still, we see a lot of errors here. And not only because the enterprises have a low bar of knowledge, but also because it is actually pretty hard sometimes. And it's pretty hard to sometimes unwingle 20-year-old legacy documentation, right? Like they don't know what IP space they have or who owns it or who is actually the guy that is responsible for publishing the IRR routes or maintaining the ROAS and all of this. So me as working as basically an engineer with no clear purpose at AWS, like I help out everywhere it needs to be helped out. I see a lot of this, and certainly there is much more that needs to be done here. And I think Manner feels and ISAC feels a very important purpose here is to also just teach people how these things work. Like it might sound easy in general, but for most it's actually not, right? It's like they don't even know what the RAR is. So where do you start if you don't know what that is? So I think that's one interesting thing that we see. And also we are creeping closer to the enterprise, like I think Joe said 350 POPs or something like that. And that is kind of the lowest bar nowadays for big cloud providers. Like we are coming closer everywhere. And that means we are coming closer to enterprises as well. I don't think that we have a vision of being able to reach all the 74,136 days numbers that you had on your map there, Andrei, but we're getting closer there. And the closer we get, the harder it gets and more complicated it becomes and more of a tutorial for us to every time we want to connect with someone new or enroll someone new, we have to start even more from the beginning. Like talking with the tier one on requirements, that is not a very hard task to do because everyone is playing the same game. But working with a small enterprise that got their IP addresses in 92 and has never touched them since, that's a bit harder learning experience. So I think that's a big thing for us coming for the next 1 to 5 years that we need to think about. And specifically to address the question about connectivity providers, we have a hard time reaching, I would say, the tier twos of the world. Like we are typically not customers of them. They can be customers to us, but we don't have a customer provider type of relationship with tier twos typically. So we cannot really put any requirements on them. Like we pair with them, but that's kind of where it ends. So I think that's the next frontier for like large scale routing security improvements globally. And I think enterprise fits an extremely important role there to be able to put requirements on top of those providers that are perhaps more used by that subtype of customers.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Fredrik. And just to mention that in Manus Plus, we're considering two cases. One is enterprise connectivity provider, right? And we hope that T1, T2s, you mentioned the pressure can be put by the enterprise themselves, right? So the enterprise can say, hey, we would like you to be sort of on par with those requirements, but also the peering requirements. And we actually consider this in Manus as well, that peers would consider if you're a Manus or not Manus participant, right? And maybe adjust their peering policy, right? I would not expect a gigabit attack coming from you. I would not expect a leak coming from you if you're Manus compliant. Do you see this kind of developing further? This kind of, I look at you and if you're Manus Plus, I can have another peering policy with you, which might be easier to set up, onboarding process, so on and so forth.
Was it directed to me, I guess?
Yes.
I wouldn't say, I don't think we're there yet. Surely in the future we will be. Like talking about DDoS specifically, that is something that we work with all of our peering providers with. We do triangulation of DDoS attacks today, and you were perhaps ISPs in this call, or perhaps the ISPs that are not on this call, right? They get to hear from me quite a lot whenever we see spoof traffic, for example, coming in like that. We will not see the end of large-scale DDoS attacks until we see the end of large-scale providers that allow spoofing, right? So So we are leaning quite hard on every peering provider, or rather a peering partner that we have, where we see spoof traffic coming in. Do we want to do this for ROV, RPKI? Yeah, maybe. Like we're getting slowly there, but certainly we're already there for DDoS. That's happening every single day, unfortunately.
Super. Well, thank you very much. And last but not least, let's turn to the governments. I mean, the governments, they're first of all, they're a regulator, of course. Not that we want regulation in the space, and actually Manus provides an alternative approach to regulation, solving the problem globally, but also they're a big customer, and procurement can be a very important factor in sort of stimulating some of the routing security developments. So let me turn to Benjamin and ask, Benjamin, what from your perspective should public procurement be looking for? And I know that Dutch government went a long way and well ahead in requiring some of the standards in the government compliant or explain list. So maybe you can elaborate on this as well.
Yes, so in the Netherlands, we have a comply or explain policy. And that policy basically requires that the standard, we have some standards on a required list, and those are required during the procurement on any agreement of more than 50,000 euros to require. And they can only explain why they don't comply in the annual report of that organization. And the standard for my work for manages this required list. And so how did currently RPKA is required there? And I think that had something to do with an incident we had in the end of 2014, where some unused IPv4 space of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually was hijacked by probably some spammers in different European countries. And this was noticed by the National Security Center of the Netherlands. And then half a year later, that became a media thing, and actually parliamentary questions were asked. So eventually, RPKL was registered for this standard on the complier explain list. And then that was in 2019. And in 2022, so last year, actually, we added on the internet.nl, which is a compliance testing tool, ROA publishing was added. So we could actually map the government-wide use IP space of public websites and mail servers. And we had some 3,000 domain names, many more routes. And the benefit was we only had like 250 network providers. So that actually was not way fewer. And 80% of that was already covered with ROAS. And actually the largest 10 network providers without ROAS covered the last half, so 10% of that space. So a few months ago, actually, we set a deadline for the government-wide implementation of RPKI before the end of 2014. And we're also looking into ROA validation, but this is a bit trickier because of the intermediate filtering, of course, to ultimately test the bot. So we do this scanning government-wide. And we also see that tools such as internet.nl really helps people who are not that technical just to have a compliance check, like, is RPKI ROAS, are they published for my website or my mail server or this network provider? And then if it's on the required list, it becomes kind of a default thing to add in the procurement phase to the requirements, and then if it's on the requirement list, we also check for compliancy, and they get a half-year report on that every government organization. And the top of the ministries also are pushing everything down that everyone should be compliant. So that really helps a lot to put this kind of internet security default standards on such a required list. yeah, currently, of course, manage is in procedure to also become to be put on a complier and explain list. I cannot say much about that because it's in a procedure. But yeah, if it would become a standard, it might be a bit trickier to check upon because, of course, manage is more diverse than just these simple things as ROA, are your ROA being published? But yeah, just putting these things into the procurement process really makes it, yeah, easier to end up with proper internet standards. Yeah, there are some other countries following, but I think with APTs, the Netherlands is really one of the first to require this government-wide. And because the government is such a large player, we also require it for example, mobile contacts and other stuff. So really large network providers who don't do, for example, ROA validation yet, are basically forced to do so very soon, or they will not get contracts from the government, and that's of course a million industry. So then the business case to implement these standards kind of gets solved automatically.
Thank you, Benjamin. And I think you saw Pierre's question in the chat, right? You just answered that question because he asks, does the Netherlands look at any other governments around the world for policy actions to support stronger routing security? And if yes, which ones?
For routing security, yeah, I haven't seen other countries that went further than the Netherlands. But we are looking around, especially in Europe, Denmark, Czech Republic, to see what those countries are doing, because they also put quite some internet security standards on requirements to implement government-wide. So we're looking into what these other European countries might be doing.
Great,
but I don't think they go that far on the routing security as the Netherlands.
So it's a good example of leading by example, and I think in our policy and messaging we also recommend governments to lead by example, and also use this in procurement practices. So I think that what you're saying, it works, right? It creates an impact. Just additional question, you saw the requirements that we're developing for Menace Plus. Do you think those package of requirements, which goes wider than just RPKI, and doesn't include DNSSEC and other great things as well, but focuses specifically on traffic security, do you think that would resonate with something that Dutch government agencies would be interested? I'm not asking for commitment, just in general. I mean, do you think it's something that is congruent?
It's a bit tricky to comment on these standards because it's in procedure. So
okay,
I cannot really do that at the moment. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your intervention. So we have some time and we have questions from the audience, and please, if you have questions, keep them coming. I mean, we'll collect them and have some time dedicated to questions and answers. But I would like to follow the Antoin example and see if there are any questions any panelist wants to ask of any other panelists.
I posed the question, right? So I heard Joe saying, the problem is often with how do you ask your customers to handle resources when they are not used to it. And I was thinking, and this is a question especially also to Matthew and Linda, what would happen? For example, we have a rule when you want to announce prefixes from RAS that your route administration is correct and you have ROAS. For our transit providers, we say you need to have proper routing administration, and otherwise we will probably block you in filters. Now, can we come up with a common set of rules for accepting prefixes from enterprises so that whenever they hit a wall at one provider, they hit the same wall at the other provider, so they will have to sort of like dig into the same rules and requirements. What would happen, and Linda and Matt, if you had to choose between a provider that would set these rules and a provider that wouldn't set these rules? So if I were to say to you, okay, I want to route your resources, but you need to delete this stale route object first, and you have to create a ROA first before I will do so. What would happen? Is that something that perhaps should be in a Manners Plus as well? That we should ask our customers to verify resources before we route anything for them?
Yeah, and maybe I don't work for a representative small enterprise for sure. So we're maybe in a little bit different position, but I mean, we would, expect that, from any place we get service from. I mean, even I go back to essentially working for a small regional ISP years ago. Our providers would always ask to have, IRR entries, to basically have all that cleaned up. I mean, that just seems to be expected behavior from any ISP that any significant enterprise would want to do business from. That's my perspective.
Yeah, from Joe. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is a good question. I actually manage, one of the teams I manage is the addressing team in Cloudflare, which is responsible for, in part, building the systems that allow customers' BYOIP prefixes to be onboarded and then advertised by Cloudflare. So this question of what barriers do you put in place for that is something that team feels every day, because this is significant friction for a lot of enterprises. Enterprises have gone out, they've spent money, they've had to deal with IP brokers, made a deal, they've finally got some addresses, and they say, finally, here it is. And then to be presented with a series of barriers that say, okay, well, you need to use this weird text-based interface that looks like it's from 1984, and you need to register this object with a maintainer object that you also don't understand. The trouble is, skipping these parts means that you end up with a prefix that harms your reputation as a cloud provider. You originate a prefix that's not clean, and suddenly you find other people less willing to deal with you. So I think, it's a bit self-serving, but my advice to enterprises would be that if you find a cloud provider or a network provider that's willing to advertise your prefix without these barriers being in place, then be afraid, because this is a provider that's probably going to struggle to maintain the level of availability performance that you need. And it's probably going to be a nest of all kinds of other traffic that you're interested in. So it's difficult. I mean, I think a lot of this industry is still based, even today, on this concept of a paper-based lower, a letter of agency, which dates long back before the internet. It's a PDF these days, which has got a Photoshopped letterhead on it and some canned text that says, I authorize this AS to announce this prefix on my behalf. Very few people read them. I suspect for a lot of providers, if you just sent them a blank PDF, it would be fine, because nobody's going to open it and look at it. And I think this is something that we as an industry have to deal with, because this is not sufficient. I think we need to take this a lot more seriously. I think it's great to imagine that we could insist on cryptographic controls for every single one of these things. We could use RPKI as a PKI and not just as a means of publishing route origin validation information. But we have to also acknowledge that this is not easy for most of our customers. The kinds of customers who are going to go to the trouble of buying a /20 to announce are not the same people who have the resources to be able to deal with that level of complexity or to maintain it in a safe way. So I think the tool chain needs to be improved, and I think the coordination needs to be improved. But I think, the good news is I see a lot of serious providers taking this seriously, and I think customers are not punishing them because these customer bases of these companies continue to grow. So I think the pressures are in the right direction, and I think we just have to make it easier.
So if I were to even lean into what Joe and Matt had said, it doesn't sound like we're not at the point that we have a ubiquitous accepted way. And what I see working with the financial services companies, it's usually some of the largest organizations that have the depth and the technical expertise. And then as they solve these problems and they're sharing, it ends up being shared and implemented by some of the medium and smaller companies. So it seems to me that's how it's got to happen, because in some small companies, they have a handful of IT and security people. They can't possibly know this level of depth, and they just want to be able to follow a standard. So I think it's getting all the standards and the best practices set and then to roll it out.
That's great to hear. I see a hand from Fredrik.
Yeah, I want to follow up there on Joe, +1 on basically everything there. And I think, like we start with the LOA, right? So that's the kind of the first line of defense, right? I think when we launched BYP, we actually did have an option to have an LOA. It was for a specific customer that simply couldn't register routes. I think it took like 2 days before that vector was abused, right? With Photoshop, right? Like, so we had to take that away, obviously. The next thing that we have that is still present today is that we put like X509 certificates in IRR records. In the beginning, we allowed every IRR source for that, including like ALTDB and these ones. That took about another 2 days before it was exploited, right? So like in a total of like 4 days, all the possible ways to exploit this was used, right? So today, we cannot accept from any of the unauthoritative IRR sources, and we want to take it an even step further, like even delete that thing completely. Like my dream and my vision, and one of the things that I do at AWS is how to get rid of IRR completely, because the system is so broken anyway. Like, why are we even trying to do live support? Right? So like the future is RPKI, and it will probably also be ASPA and perhaps even BGP-SEC, right? And I think we are in a good position to, never go back on any of those promises, right? Like, so far we haven't. The same thing, whenever we started with origin validation back in the days, we built a whole exception system. It's like, oh, how do we accept something that is invalid? And how do we use it? How do we break that glass and make sure that those things work? Because we were super afraid of, hey, here comes super large customer number one. They want to announce invalids to us. We need a function to be able to essentially set aside all the routing security things that we have in place. So far, since 2019, when we implemented it the first time, we had 6 requests to use it. We never used it. And I think it shouldn't really be much difference for an ISP of any size or way, that if you're just, that you have a good cause of building all these sometimes fairly convoluted systems, then I think the customer will understand that this is actually for the greater good, and not because you're trying to be, overly cautious about anything. It's actually, those are the providers that we want, that have the highest requirements and has all these processes to actually make things work.
Right. It should be positive marketing spin, right? You don't consider Not3 as a barrier to your deal, but as an important control, right? Yeah, very good point. Okay, we have some time left, and I would like to stimulate the discussion by throwing some questions from the audience. Robbie, how many questions do we have? Okay, we have 5 questions. How shall we go about that? Maybe you can just read them aloud one by one, and we'll see who answers that. Okay, a question from Pierre. Thank you for your presentation and the panel discussion. My question is the following. Does Menace Plus constitute the future direction of Menace project? Plus, are there any others? And finally, are there any ways individuals with an interest in Menace university students could get involved in this endeavor? Well, maybe I'll take this question. And Matt, who is my partner in crime, we are chairing working group, Menace Plus working group together, can jump in. So Menace Plus is part of the Menace development, right? It's not necessarily the future. Menace is the base, and it will continue to exist. And it focuses more on what we call this collective action problem. Menace Plus more focusing on enterprise connectivity provider, their cloud provider relationship, right? And we're looking for a better articulated business case to stimulate routing security globally, right? While Menace stimulates the norm setting to move the needle. Now, to get involved, yes, it's still possible. Please send the mail to contact@menace.org, and we'll be happy to include you in the work of the Menace Plus working group. Matt, did I cover everything?
Yep, I think so.
Okay. A question from Steve. I think it would be good to have an example of a service provider has documented their transparency. Anyone wants to take this question or respond? Or give an example?
I'm not entirely sure of the context of that question. I mean, I think transparency means a lot of things. I think it can mean publishing actions that you intend to take so that somebody else can compare your published actions with what you're doing. In that sense, it's not so dissimilar from an audit. You have controls and you have observations. I think another thing to look at is participation of providers in forums like this, in the IETF, in the other kinds of forums where people speak openly about problems we have and improvements we can make. It used to be, I mean, it's almost fallen out of fashion these days, I think, to have, network providers and cloud providers use the fact that they participate in these kinds of communities as marketing, because I think, perhaps that's not a valued way. Perhaps there are better ways of presenting your advantage, but it's still important. It was important back in the late 90s. It's kind of still important today. And so I think that's a measure of the transparency and the openness that providers have towards this kind of thing. I think it's important to see people participating and acknowledging that we're not just following the rules, we're making the rules, because the rules always could do with improvement.
Thank you. Antoin, I see your hand, but just to respond to Steve's question, I think Steve asks about the transparency, supply chain transparency is one of the requirements we posted there. And what was the idea is that you can disclose who your upstream providers are, for instance, right? And therefore your customer can evaluate, okay, well, that is not the provider would like my traffic to go through, something like this. So Antoine, did you want to answer to that question?
Yeah, I think a lot of the transparency is already there when you're a Menace participant, right? So there's the Menace Observatory where you can actually see which action items you're following up to and what your score is since the 1st of July. But you can also see that all network providers make mistake. We had a spoofing incident at the beginning of this month, so our numbers dropped, which will increase again next month. But so I think publishing your transparency also requires the same sort of knowledge, and that will be difficult to grasp in a simple red, yellow, green stoplight, right? I know, for example, that the RER Explorer, which I think is a good example of how you can simplify looking at a network or an owner of prefixes to see if they did everything right. And Menace Observatory is something else that where you can actually see what they are supporting or not. But there are also tools, of course, in terms of transparency, vendor transparency, where routing is public data, right? You can actually see all the connections on the internet, but you just need to know the tools where to look for them. So for routing, this is okay. The other thing, of course, that can get you a little bit more insight is vendors, but I don't know if people want to go that far.
Thank you. Robbie, do we have more questions from the audience? Okay, there are two questions from Justin. Do you think there is a way to hold entities accountable for supply chain risks and or incentivize them to lean forward? Any thoughts on that?
that's actually why I asked the question, you know, can we come up with a common set of rules of what we are accepting, right? Because that would probably also mean the same, hold people accountable. If you don't have ROAS, if you don't have your routing illustration in order, we don't accept your prefixes. So that's also a form of accountability, I think. It's in synthesize, I think this is also, are you willing to support your customers by educating them? And I think that's a very important aspect. And I think that's something that we can have a lot more help with. And that's also why Manners, I think, is doing a good job by saying, you know, simplify requirements by saying, you know, if you're Manners compliant, if you have a certain score, then it will simplify incentives for others to be compliant too. Because in the end, I will hope that, you know, RFPs will have Manners as a requirement in there.
Yeah, and just to add to this, I mean, in the survey, we asked those questions and some of the entities answered that they require some of the requirements, not so much about the risks, but they require those requirements in the contracts. I mean, we didn't have time, but maybe if we have context, we'll go in deep. And I'd love to see the real statement in the contract, how RPKI is required, for instance. But there were answers where entities require those in the contracts. I don't know the details yet, but we can explore that further.
Oh yeah, I've seen RFPs already that you know, ask us each and every question about routing security, but you know, one customer uses one list, another customer uses another list, and it would be nice if they would all have the same framework to ask the same questions. You know, I don't want to get asked question like, do you filter on bogons? Do you filter on RC 1980 in address space? Do you filter on you know, each and every single item that they've read in the security framework? It would be better if they just ask, are you Manners compliant?
Right. I think that partly answers the second question from Justin is, can we get from the know your customer to know your supplier diligence requirements? I think what we're developing Manners Plus is exactly that, right? To know your supplier better and describe this in one word rather than, you know, a laundry list of various requirements and with sort of varying level of assurance. But any other thoughts?
Well, I think there's another way of looking at this. There's two ways. These relationships between customers and suppliers. There's one directed question says, how can we make sure that the suppliers are living up to what we ask them to do? And what is the impact if they don't? How can we hold them to account? There's another direction for this, which is to say, how can we encourage customers to require this kind of thing when they put out RFPs, when they are looking for suppliers? How can we persuade customers that it's actually, there are other things than just price? When you go looking for something, when you choose a supplier, there are other things as well. And I think there are other areas where this has worked. I think we have other examples of where procurement has based policies that, for example, don't buy things from supply chains that are known to have human rights violations and things like that. And these things are actually well established, and companies are proud to be able to say we do these things properly. And I think the challenge is to try and find an equivalent kind of measure where people can install these policies and decide away from any particular purchasing decision. In general, we will support suppliers that behave like this. And I think that will be another big step forward.
Thank you. Yeah, and Benjamin adds to that, it's also important to monitor on RPKI because it's always easy just to check the box during procurement without actual checking. That was actually another question in the survey, and many people asked that they use tools to check the requirements, but many of them, and probably majority, answered that they rely on the explanation of their supplier, which probably a checkbox. Okay, now we have no more questions, and I think we are ready to wrap up, and I think we have polls coming up. before we're doing this, I don't know, maybe I'll just get off the air, but I would like to thank all the panelists. I mean, great input, great conversation. I personally learned a lot. So thank you very much for this panel, and thank you for the audience that listened to us, and we are going to the poll. Thank you.